Hello, good evening, and welcome to this evening's edition of Tisky Sound. My name is Aaron Bastani. I've got the great pleasure of being joined by Michael Walker. Michael, how are you doing?
I'm very well. Fancy joining you on Tisky Sour on a weekday evening.
Well, actually, we have got a great show lined up, and this is going to be probably quite a bit different to last night. Last night was a bit of a roundup of the news. We're going to start off tonight's show with Panorama from yesterday evening. Remarkable 30 minutes of journalism. Before we go any further, just want to say very quickly, if you could tweet your comments on the hashtag Tisky Sour over on Twitter, or put them here towards the end of the show with the rocket emoji. We'll be responding to questions. Also, share the show link. It's in the description. I believe there's a tweet. You can find that tweet. If you can share that, get more people to watch this show. We always appreciate it. And we know that, our core audience understand the importance of the kind of journalism we're doing. And obviously, we want to take that to as big an audience as possible. We really appreciate it. And can I say, Michael, given it's just us tonight, I think you've done a fantastic job over the last few months. And it's not just been on this show with your interviews. I think on Twitter, I'm going to use the F word. I think you've been forensic.
Oh, I like that, Aaron. I'll take that. Well, I've got nothing else to do. I quite like the focus that it provides being in the middle of a sort of political drama when you can't leave your house.
Yeah, no, I think you've been outstanding, and that's why people should subscribe to Novara Media as well. We are going to talk first about, like I said, the Panorama episode from last night, before looking at how the furlough scheme, which has already been in train for a few weeks, of course, it's being backdated to March 1st, could actually end up costing far more than initially anticipated. And then we'll look at goings on in Brexit and the fact that Michael Gove is still adamant we will not need to renegotiate anything, and that we are absolutely or very likely leaving towards the end of this year on December 31st. Firstly, Panorama, like I say, really remarkable. Recommend you go and watch that straight after this. Several big claims were made in that show, all I think very significantly evidenced. Firstly, there were no gowns, visors, swabs, or body bags in the government's pandemic stockpile when COVID-19 reached the UK, as there should have been, according to their own advice. Secondly, things like bin liners and hand detergent were classified as PPE, while gloves were being accounted as single gloves as a piece of PPE rather than a pair of gloves being PPE, because of course one glove doesn't really help when you have two hands. Thirdly, staff said they're being put at risk because of the shortage of personal protective equipment. And finally, and this strikes me as probably the most egregious point isolated during the show in regards to the short-term politicking of the Tory government, that the virus was downgraded in early May to ensure that PPE thresholds could be similarly lowered and thus met. In short, changing the virus so that it was no longer, quote, considered to be a higher consequence infectious disease in the UK took the government slightly off the hook. So let's go to that first clip from last night about PPE and how the government is accounting for these things.
For weeks, the government has been dealing with criticism about stocks of personal protective equipment, or PPE. It says it's delivered 1 billion items. But we've obtained documents from inside the supply chain that show the reality of what's been delivered in the past couple of months. They show that the government is counting items you might not think of as PPE, such as cleaning equipment, waste bags, detergent and paper towels. More than half the items are surgical gloves, and in most cases each individual glove is counted rather than pairs. The second biggest item is plastic aprons that offer limited protection.
So, I mean, Michael, I'm going to bring you in on this. It basically sounds like we didn't have any PPE. I'm going to talk shortly about the things that weren't being stockpiled, but the things that were being stockpiled, the aprons weren't adequate. The gloves, which was the number one thing, they were sort of double counting them. What do you make of this? I know we've been talking about the government being asleep at the wheel, but this kind of categorization really reveals a complete absence of appropriate preparations, it sounds.
Well, there's two issues, aren't there? So there's one, which is, I suppose, the really significant issue, the most consequential one, which is the extent to which they didn't stockpile the necessary PPE. And so we've been sending people to the front line in the war against coronavirus completely unprepared, completely without the defense that they need, the basic defense that they need. So the kind of proper gowns that you see people wearing in other countries. Here, people have bins as if they're dinner ladies, right? So to send people to go and face a highly infectious, dangerous disease wearing those things is outrageous. The second issue, though, is something that we always knew, really, which is when the government stands up and says we've got 1 billion pieces of PPE. I mean, it's a completely meaningless statistic. It always has been, right? And I actually think, all credit to the BBC for making this documentary. Brilliant film, as you say. I feel like that idea that Matt Hancock sort of stands up there and says we've delivered 1 billion pieces of PPE and this is an unprecedented situation. We've created more PPE than ever. Those were always nonsensical claims. And I do think that actually if someone had asked in one of those press conferences beforehand, how are you counting up this billion? Are you counting gloves as one piece or 2 pieces because there's 2 gloves? Are you counting, it turns out they're counting paper towels in this, all of these kind of things that no one would really think of as PPE, but the government sort of throw out these figures to show, this is we're trying really, really hard. The figures are huge. You idiot public person, you couldn't make 1 billion pieces of PPE and send them to hospitals. So it's, I mean, in a way, this is one of those instances where it confirms something we already knew, which is that the government are more interested in PR than actual delivery throughout so much of this crisis, and PPE has been a prime example of that.
On the paper towels thing, do you think they were accounting a single paper towel as a piece of PPE?
I don't think it was a single paper towel, but I think it was potentially per roll. So I think.
I mean, who knows?
Roll of paper towel was counted as one.
I mean, who knows? It might be like a packet of 10, and that's like a bit. And this is like you say, there might be a warehouse full of like paper towels somewhere, and the government can say we have 100 million pieces of PPE in Hampshire. And it's like, well, there's actually nothing in Hampshire except for a warehouse of paper towels, and paper towels are great, but they're not going to keep people safe. We're going to go to the next clip, and this is specifically about the problem of gowns.
The government says that having a stockpile is considered a very high quality mark in international terms. But there is a problem with what's been bought.
The government didn't stock these warehouses with all the equipment that was recommended. They didn't buy any hospital gowns at all.
Panorama has discovered that just last year, the government's own advisors warned that gowns were needed in the stockpile, but still none were bought.
I mean, this is crazy, right, Michael? No gowns were stockpiled, no gowns. And you're confronted with, a pandemic like we have. I mean, thank God it wasn't something like Ebola. I mean, we would have been wiped out. We would have faced a wipeout. The NHS would have collapsed after a couple of days. I mean, how's this happened?
Well, I mean, this also, shows the, meaningless PR that they often deliver in those press conferences, which, are sometimes challenged, but not consistently enough. So one of them was this idea we've created 1 billion pieces of PPE, completely meaningless. The other one they always say is, look, there's a shortage in global demand. There's a shortage in global demand of PPE, so we can't be blamed for any shortages.
Supply.
It's a global phenomenon. Sorry, global supply. There's an excess of global demand. But the point is that the whole point of pandemic planning, and they go into this in the show, is that you can foresee that when there's a pandemic, there will be an excess in global demand and a shortage in global supply, which is precisely why you need to stockpile. So for the government to stand up there and say, oh, it's out of our control because there's a shortage of global supply. Yes, that was the whole point. That was why you needed to stockpile, and why their failure to do so is so egregious.
And in terms of the short-term issues, we'll come to that in a second. I'm not sure if we've got 3 or 4 clips coming out of this Panorama documentary. We have 4. One of them makes this really, really, really salient. But who would you lay the blame at in terms of because the longer term issue is that ultimately Boris Johnson's only really been the prime minister with a majority. You have to sort of try and be even-handed here. Since December 2019, clearly the stockpiling issues go way, way, way back. So how do you think politically blame should be cast here? Because he probably wouldn't even have been in receipt of the fact that, stockpiling of these particular things is an issue. I mean, that might have been put on his desk in February. I mean, it may have gone on his desk literally as coronavirus was becoming an issue. So how do you sort of navigate that politically? Does that mean that number 10 is a bit insulated from blame and actually we should look a bit more at Theresa May and David Cameron? Or do you think also Boris Johnson carries the can here?
I mean, I think in terms of the long-term winding down of the stockpile, so they did sort of say that, the stockpile used to be fuller than it is now. I think that's going to quite squarely go on the door of austerity. So austerity encouraged various public institutions to try and find efficiency savings, which basically meant cutting costs wherever you possibly can without collapsing the following day. So you had Public Health England, who I think, I'm sure the government are going to try and scapegoat, and you've already seen the Tory press try to scapegoat Public Health England. They're going to say, look, it was their job to do this planning, and they failed to do it. But you also know that Public Health England, they got gold stars if ever they saved a cost, if ever they shaved off some spending here or shaved off some spending there. And when they went and spoke to the Secretary of Health or the Chancellor, which was George Osborne at the time, I'm sure he didn't say, oh, well, are you sure you're prepared well enough for if a pandemic come? I think he was probably saying, like, are you sure you can't, cut your costs a bit more here or bend a few corners over there? Do you know what? Cut a few corners over there. Like, I think this is going to be austerity. And then I think, as we're going to go on to discuss, Boris Johnson, where it should, squarely, he is to blame, is the inaction in February, late January, February, and early March to really get on top of this.
Okay, so let's go with that in mind to the next clip.
The government has been accused of failing to act quickly enough. Here's the kind of opportunity we missed. This factory in Bolton makes the protective fabric needed to make specialist PPE gowns and masks. But they weren't approached by the government in February, and in March, the company offered their services.
I've personally written to government myself, written to MPs, and we've also written to Public Health England. At this stage, we haven't really had a response.
We filmed 10 days after the company offered to help the UK, but they still hadn't heard back. This order is for the United States.
Currently, that line is running for about 5 to 6 days a week, and the capacity is currently really 80 to 90% is being bought by America. So potentially Trump is buying this UK capacity, which obviously we want to support the NHS if possible, but currently that's where this material is going.
The factory is now finally providing material for the NHS through a private supplier. But in the missing weeks, it could have provided enough material for almost 300,000 gowns.
I mean, this just really compounds your earlier point, Michael, about how everything is about public relations, press, and spin. At the start of this crisis in early March, you were hearing stories about how JCB, Dyson were going to reorient production from, hand dryers and diggers to ventilators. And actually, there were existing businesses in Britain who make the stuff we need actually more right now than ventilators right now. PPE, we're going to need it long term, lots and lots of PPE. And even now, to this day, they're not being contacted by government per se, but by an independent supplier acting on the behalf of the NHS. So at the very moment they were saying, we're going to, Matt Hancock was tweeting about get in touch. The government was really getting the problem sort of by the scruff of the neck. I mean, that was all a lie, wasn't it? It wasn't. It was a deception. We weren't really being fed how the government was trying to respond to that crisis in real time, were we?
Well, you should look at the claims that were made and the reality. So when Matt Hancock realized the government were under pressure because of lack of ventilators and lack of PPE, their big announcement was, we're setting up an email address. And if you email this email address, then we'll sort of hook you up with NHS providers, and then we'll get the ball rolling when it comes to building up Britain's stock of this stuff. What actually happened is you get big manufacturers like these guys. They email that email address. No one gets back to them. They call the number. No one gets back to them. And then what is the government excuse? They say, oh, we've had 9,000 people get in touch. We couldn't get back to everyone. And then they said, we have to prioritize big providers. Now, this firm that appeared in that documentary, which we've just seen sort of shown there, they could have produced, they said, 300,000 of these gowns in February. Now, Britain has only provided the NHS with about 1.3 million. So that's, around one fifth. They could have increased our stockpile of gowns by 1/5. Just this one factory whose email got lost in the inbox of the Department of Health because they seem completely incapable of any kind of strategic forward planning.
And why do you think that is? Do you think that's because of the the incompetence of certain people at the top of government in this country, or do you think it speaks to a broader structural issue in regards to procurement and government, and how neoliberalism has basically reconfigured the role of the state and how it relates to things like healthcare?
So again, I think it's two things, like a medium term and a short term. So the medium term is that austerity has ground down the ability of the Department of Health to think ahead, because the priority for so long has been, what corners can we cut? How can we try and make each year's winter crisis less of an embarrassment than the last?
Yeah.
And never are they thinking sort of where is there a need for extra investment so that we can be prepared for a rainy day, you know? So and I imagine that sort of that's where the expertise is now concentrated in the Department of Health, is how to cut costs, not how to prepare for future crises. The other is that Boris Johnson has brought into Downing Street a group of people who think they are geniuses, right? They think they are the bee's knees and everyone else is an idiot. And they do have some pedigree, you know, to think that they are intelligent people who have succeeded in certain domains of life. But the only domain of life where they have succeeded, I'm not saying it's an irrelevant one, we talk about it a lot, is winning elections. So Boris Johnson's team is very good at PR. Their PR throughout this whole crisis has been really good. I hate it when Labour politicians get up and say the problem is the confused messaging. No, their messaging has been brilliant. The PR has been brilliant. Boris Johnson is very, very, very good at communications. Dominic Cummings is very, very good at organizing successful election campaigns. And that has given them this kind of hubris, you know, that we are the most incredible political strategic minds out there. But they forgot that actually politics is about more than public opinion and winning elections. Sometimes you actually have to manage things and do the nitty-gritty, not particularly glamorous work of building up stockpiles of visors, you know, something that I don't think Boris Johnson or Dominic Cummings are particularly interested in.
Yeah, I think Will Davies at the beginning of this had a really good analysis. And, you know, neoliberalism as a sort of orthodoxy seeks to detach politics from economics, or political oversight from economic production. And obviously in a situation like this, you have to sort of reintegrate those two things, even if temporarily, right? Even if that's not necessarily a politics, you recognize you have to do that, like Churchill in 1940-41. You know, no, he didn't want to, you know, be in charge of a centralized economy, but you have to do it. And like you say, I mean, these people seem almost to sort of their dispositions, that genre of politics is almost like an allergy. You know, that was the last thing they were going to do. I mean, they might do it like in the next month, 2 months, by which point, you know, the virus has been with us for 4 or 5 months. The first people to have it in this country were towards the end of January. I think it was 2 Chinese students in York. I think we'll talk about that more in the sort of questions at the end with regard to the long, medium and short-term consequences going on here. We're going to go to the final clip now. And this was actually really heartbreaking. It's a short clip, but in many ways the most powerful one we're going to see tonight.
This public demonstration of support means such a lot to those who work in the NHS. But some of them worry that this outpouring of emotion helps the government gloss over the shortages that are on some of the wards. As one intensive care nurse said to us, calling us heroes just makes it okay when we die.
That's terrifying, right? I mean, I've heard somebody else say sort of are dead, the way it was being referred to, are fallen NHS workers. And it was the same kind of rhetoric mobilized in regards to, say, war remembrance. And that's kind of what that person was hinting at, right? How this offers a form of political cover, and how actually these people didn't need to die. It was totally the result of political choices.
It's the same as the medal campaign, right? So this idea that we're going to give all frontline NHS staff a medal. Obviously, I don't oppose giving anyone a medal, but it strikes one as a distraction. And also this rhetoric that we're fighting the war of coronavirus, I think does help the government, because that all sort of feeds into this idea of it being unforeseen, it being sort of an act of God almost, and us all being in it together against it. And whilst, you know, it's a truism to say no one could have predicted that a novel coronavirus would hit the UK in early 2020, which would have moved from a bat, and which will, you know, the precise details of this coronavirus crisis could not be predicted. But the fact that there was, you know, a pandemic, the possibility of a pandemic, and the likelihood of one, you know, the not negligible possibility that there would be a big pandemic was the number one threat which the government knew about. So the idea that this has taken them by surprise and it's completely reasonable that they weren't remotely prepared and didn't remotely have enough PPE or basic knowledge about the need to test people early on. I mean, that is just inexcusable. And this whole idea that it's this completely unforeseen exogenous shock is just ridiculous.
There was something it was about 10 days ago now. It wasn't the weekend that's just gone, the weekend before that, where you had Andrew Marr on his show. He was just talking to some BBC reporter. It wasn't an external guest. And he said that. He said, oh, how could anybody have known? Just making excuses for the government. And the word coronavirus is being widely used for COVID-19, but this is in fact the third coronavirus. There have been 2 previous coronaviruses which have come out of mainland China. One is MERS. It's particularly prevalent now in the Arabian Peninsula. And there was, of course, I think SARS. I mean, Michael, you can correct me on this. I think that's correct.
There's been 3 novel coronaviruses which were potential world health problems because they move from an animal. There are also coronaviruses which are like the common cold. Yeah, but there have been 3 pandemic coronaviruses.
Yeah, since 2000, right? And the whole film Contagion. The context for that was previous things like, although avian flu I don't think came from mainland China, but there's a series of pandemics, and this is the third novel coronavirus, like you say, which is really throws up really big challenges. So when he says, oh well, and this is what Marr was hinting at, well, all the policymakers just presumed it would be a form of influenza. How could we have known? Well, we've had 2 of these already, very novel forms. That's before we go into things like Ebola, where the mortality rate's something like 50%. It's much easier to deal with because the symptoms don't present and as often. It's far more contagious with COVID. What did you want to say, Michael? Sorry.
Well, I was going to say even with so people have explained sort of why they were slow to implement a lockdown in terms of they were preparing for a flu and preparing for herd immunity. But in terms of the lack of PPE, even their planning for a flu pandemic told them that they needed gowns, and told them that they needed eye protection. So it wasn't, here they can't even complain that they can't even claim that they didn't see it coming, because they did, and they made an active choice that we're not going to bother investing in these things because we're more interested in cutting costs than we are in saving lives.
No, that's a really good point, actually. But I do think we have to remember, it could have been much worse. And actually, it was in the Sunday Times article, and somebody said they saw how the government was responding to the coronavirus, and they said, well, thank God this isn't the big one. Otherwise, we'd be really, really screwed. And by big one, they mean something with the mortality rate, somewhere closer to Ebola than what we have with this, maybe 2-3%.
Well, it killed kids, right? Imagine if this virus was one that was, and many flus actually are, they affect most severely older people and younger people. So we could quite easily have had a flu which was taking young people. And as we've said, an older life is not less valuable. We shouldn't say, oh, they were going to die anyway. But at the same time, if we had people who in the prime of their life were being taken out, and obviously some people actually in the prime of their life are being taken out this, but you can imagine if this was primarily hitting people in their teens or their 20s or their 30s, there would be an added level of tragedy to this.
Yeah,
and that could have happened.
Yeah, it could have been far, far worse. We've got 1,503 people watching. Great to have you all on board. We've got 598 likes. Smash the like button. We really appreciate it. Michael, I'll leave it over to him. I'm not meant to bunch them all together, but Michael's really passionate about getting the numbers up for this show. It's his baby. Who can blame him?
I want to get subscribers for the channel as well, so hit that. Hit
the subscribe button. We're going to look at, actually, this is a press release now, and this was made by, I think it was Public Health England. As of late March. This is pretty remarkable stuff, and actually it's hinted at in the documentary. As of 19th of March 2020, COVID-19 is no longer considered to be a high consequence infectious disease. HCID I've lost it here. In the HCID in the UK, the Four Nations Public Health HCID group made an interim recommendation in January 2020 to classify COVID-19 as an HCID. As you can see, high consequence infectious disease. This was based on consideration of the UK HCID criteria about the virus and the disease, with information available during the early stages of the outbreak, of course. This wasn't visible in China even until December. Next slide. Now that more is known about COVID-19, Like I said, this is 19th of March. The public health bodies in the UK have reviewed the most up-to-date information about COVID-19 against the UK HCID criteria. They have determined that several features have now changed. In particular, more information is available about mortality rates, low overall, and there is now greater clinical awareness and a specific and sensitive laboratory test, the availability of which continues to increase. Now, one of the claims made in the Panorama show last night was that actually that threshold was brought down on purpose, precisely because the government recognized late on it had inadequate stockpiles of PPE to actually deal with a high infectious disease. Michael, we actually had a conversation about this at the time. I don't know if you remember, and I kind of did a fairly innocuous tweet. And I said, this is weird. Why is it being downgraded? I'm sure there's a technical explanation. And some people said, yeah, it's because there's now a test. I mean, I don't see why that makes something less consequential or infectious or dangerous. But there you go. And so I didn't really think about it. And even in our private exchanges, I said, this kind of seems weird, right? And you were like, yeah, it does. But I mean, the technical answers seem appropriate, which they do. They logically make sense. Go on.
The test thing doesn't make any sense. I completely agree with you that on that Panorama document, the government, well, even in that original press release, why does having a test for something make it less dangerous? Like, I don't care whether I can get tested for Ebola or not. I just don't want Ebola, right? But I mean, the explanation I saw for that downgrading, which I thought seemed somewhat reasonable, is that it is less dangerous than something like, I mean, obviously I don't know where the thresholds were, right? No idea. So even though this is a very high impactful on the macro level disease, its death rate for any one individual is potentially not as high as something like Ebola. And also one of the explanations I heard for why it had been downgraded is that meant that people could go to normal hospitals. Instead of if you got flied in with Ebola, maybe you'd only be able to go to a specialist hospital. Again, I'm speaking now not from a position of expertise on this particular issue, but I have heard from many medics since then, and this documentary seems to confirm it, that actually what the government were thinking about was that they wanted to be able to stand up in front of the press every day at their 5 p.m. press conferences. And whenever they were asked difficult questions about PPE shortages, they'd say, oh, we have got enough PPE. We've got enough PPE for everyone to be able to meet the requirements that have been set by Public Health England. And what's clear is when they were deciding what those requirements should be, Public Health England were taking into account supply. So they were saying, given that we've got this much PPE, what's the best way for people to wear it? And that was by no means a safe amount of PPE.
Yeah, let's go now to that fifth video clip from Panorama, where they talk about some of the issues surrounding that downgrade and the politics of it, and whether it was really about letting the government off the hook.
It seems clear that rules have been changed because of the shortages. In January, the government designated COVID-19 as what's called a high-consequence infectious disease. The Health and Safety Executive had already investigated what PPE was needed when tackling a high-consequence infectious disease. It concluded all staff should wear a respirator face mask, full face visor and a gown. And the government has a legal obligation to make sure NHS staff have the right kit.
But 6 weeks ago, the government downgraded COVID-19. The most consequential disease of the last 100 years was taken off the list of the highly consequential infectious diseases.
Here are the recommended PPE components: apron, alcohol hand rub, gloves.
At the same time the virus was downgraded, the government weakened the guidelines on PPE.
Step 1. Put on your disposable apron.
Health workers were now told they were safe to wear the less protective aprons and surgical masks in all but the most dangerous situations.
Carefully make this type of surgical face mask is secured around the ears with elastic.
God, that voice sounds so, it's like something out of Children of Men, doesn't it, Michael? the changing classification, and I think the fact that the Financial Times, it's a pretty credible news outlet, is suggesting that so far 45,000 people have died. I mean, the idea, and this is without doubt the biggest public health crisis we've had in this country as a result of contagion since 1918, 1919. The idea that you would downgrade it at the very moment it was arriving here does seem strange. And as I reported in a video in the Environment Media at the time, that was done around the same time that I believe it was Chris Whitty was going on to Sky News, going on to Radio 4, saying that the strategy was herd immunity. So, Michael, I'm going to ask you a question here. Those were words that weren't really mentioned on last night's Panorama documentary. But do you think that the long-term issues as a result of austerity, as you've correctly highlighted, around a lack of stockpiles of aprons, of all the necessary kit, do you think that wasn't addressed with the rapidity that it should have been and could have been, as was highlighted by that smaller manufacturing firm in, I think, the Northwest, because the strategy was herd immunity?
A bit of both. I mean, it's what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? So you can say, why did they not build up extra supplies in February? Because they had a herd immunity strategy, and so they didn't realize it was as dangerous as it was. Because even if you were going for herd immunity, I mean, almost 100 NHS workers have died. So even if the herd immunity strategy worked, can you please protect people on the front line? There doesn't seem to be any explanation for it. The other idea is they went for herd immunity because they didn't think they had the capacity to do the testing and the tracing that you would need to actually suppress it. So herd immunity was a response to a lack of capacity and a response to not having invested enough previously. There is one thing I want to say about this. This point about Public Health England seemingly being willing to downgrade the advice or downgrade the regulations to meet supply. And I think there has been quite a dangerous elision between a politician's desire to make themselves look good and not admit they're in a bad situation or that they've failed, that they haven't properly prepared, and the desire of, I suppose, paternalistic public health bodies to try and not panic the public. And you see this directly in the sort of the demands that the instructions that are given to frontline workers to say you shouldn't talk actively about lack of PPE because it will worry the public. Right. So you've got this sort of public health explanation for making excuses for the government. So doctors have to stand up and say everything's okay. And their justification is that if they don't do that, it will have a bad public health effect because panics aren't helpful in pandemics. But it just also happens to be incredibly convenient for the government that they found this sort of, benevolent excuse for why scientists and doctors have to cover for them.
Yeah. And I think the whole thing as well, I think it almost looks like there was a bet made, like you say, in February, March, where the government said, people like Dominic Cummings, people around Boris Johnson said, okay, what are we good at? What do we back ourselves doing? Solving a public health crisis in the context of 10 years of underfunding. We don't really back ourselves to do that. Or we go for this other thing, herd immunity. Do we back ourselves on the strategic communications front? Because we get such a free pass from the press to actually be able to sell potentially 100,000 deaths plus as a justifiable way of dealing with this crisis. And it does feel like that was the strategy. And I think it's compounded by the fact that really no major decisive steps were taken until early mid-March, as that great piece of journalism highlights. On the issue of Public Health England and advisory bodies, because of course we've seen that downgrading being as a result of public health bodies, just highlighting a piece over the last couple of days which shows how Dominic Cummings reveals how Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's chief advisor, was actually present at meetings of SAGE, the country's secret advisory group, in regards to decisions being made, the scientific decisions being made about what was going on. So that's SAGE, and the sort of political impartiality of that, one might suggest, is compromised. We talked about this on the show previously. Do you think that it's kind of odd, Michael, that if you look at, I think it's, let me get the correct names to these bodies up. The Government's Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens was one of the people that inputted into that press release about the downgrade. That has minuted meetings every year from 2002 to 2017. There are no minuted meetings of this body, this public body, which is meant to be there offering advice in occasions like this, which are of huge public significance. We don't know who's on this panel. We can't find, or I can't find, I've been looking, we can't find their minutes. I mean, again, it just speaks to this kind of neoliberal idea of politics where you talk about transparency, but you do anything but be transparent.
Well, you have to always find an excuse for transparency, which is supposedly in the public good. So they say, oh, the reason we can't have minutes is because we don't want these experts to be responding to public opinion. We don't want them to be thinking, oh, will I get held account? You want them to give completely objective opinions inside that room, which won't be, influenced by them wanting to be seen on the right side of history, which, according to this theory, brings about bad science. I think this pandemic has completely shown that to be an incredibly poor way of making policy decisions. I think in terms of this Sage story, one of the most interesting angles I saw was Anthony Costello, who was one of the directors of the World Health Organization.
UCL, I think, right?
Yeah, he was saying the real problem with this body is that of 23 members, 13 of them are on the government payroll. And if you've got Dominic Cummings in that meeting, who himself is basically the almost the head of the government, then you've got people who are in a room with ultimately someone who's very close to their employer. And so the incentives to dissent or to say something which makes you seem like, a problem character who is going to cause embarrassment for the government or advise them to take a position they don't really want to take for political reasons is intense. So the idea, and this is something the media have really, really fucked up on. They have thought that chief medical officer is this sort of independent role within the medical establishment who's, they sort of talk about him as if he's elected by doctors, but no, he's employed by the government, right? And so you can't take him as this chief god science, teller of truth. I'm not saying he's, cynically lying to us all, but he's an advisor. He's not, it's not an independent authority. He's an advisor.
You put it so well. I mean, I think there's two issues here, right? The lack of understanding how these roles work and appointments and incentives, and then I think a kind of fetishization of science in the abstract. Marco Kinney tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour. It almost seems government still, emphasis, has a herd immunity mindset with all this foot dragging on PPE. Only external pressure has forced them to belatedly get their skates on regarding PPE. Couldn't agree more, Marco. We've got 1,500 people watching. It'd be great to get that to 1,600, 1,536. Let's get to 1,000 likes as quickly as possible. Share the show. We really appreciate it. We're going to talk about a few other issues now. We'll be quick, get to a few questions. First up, the furlough scheme announced by Rishi Sunak about a month ago. It kind of rolled out a week ago, but it's going back to the 1st of March. It ensures that people who are being paid up to £2,500 a month get 80% of their pay. It's expected to cost the Exchequer 40 billion plus, and it was extended through to the end of June a couple of weeks ago. But the thing is, it's becoming increasingly clear that as more and more people adopt it, suddenly dropping it right at the beginning of July would lead to a massive spike in unemployment. This is from the Financial Times today. Quote, Rishi Sunak, Chancellor, has told MPs he's planning a gradual winding down of the government's hugely expensive job support scheme in an attempt to avert a surge in unemployment after its scheduled expiry on June 30th. Mr. Sunak suggested the economy would have to be gradually weaned off tens of billions of pounds of state support as it recovers from the coronavirus crisis, avoiding what one Tory MP called a convulsive, quote, cold turkey effect. Next card, the Treasury said it was talking to business and unions about how to phase out the furlough scheme. One option being discussed would be to gradually cut the wage subsidy over a number of months, perhaps first to 60 to 40. So you go 80, 60, 40. Michael, we're talking huge sums of money here, right? Because already the figure of 40 billion is actually inaccurate because I don't think it accounts for that extra month. But we know it's going to be more than 40 billion. Of course, we don't know how many people are going to participate in the process, etc. So let's say right now it's 40 to 50 billion. However, if it rolled on subsequently throughout the summer, maybe into the autumn at 60, 40, 20% rates, I mean, this could end up costing a lot more than 40 to 50 million. It may be close to 100 billion than 40 billion. Let's say 60, 70, 80 billion seems quite reasonable given the things that are being touted here. Given those numbers, do you think Labour has a big opportunity here just to say, hang on a second, why don't we just reform unemployment benefit? Why do we have to keep this scheme going for that much longer? Why don't we just double JSA? if these jobs aren't really going to come back, and if you're worried about labour market distortions because people are being paid to do nothing, and you actually want them to go look for other jobs, then fine, so be it. Let's actually pay them a decent amount of money while they go do that. Do you think there's a good opportunity here for Labour to really change the conversation around unemployment benefit?
Yeah, well, in terms of how that directly relates to the furlough, I'm not sure in terms of how that would relate, directly to unemployment benefit. I think the furlough, or this tapering off the furlough, seems to me to be a no-brainer. There is going to be the idea that there's going to be this huge bounce back of demand, and that suddenly businesses can go full steam ahead after the lockdown, I think is for the birds. But in terms of your unemployment point, I think there is going to be a more of a medium-term issue, which is that many people, many industries, even with tapered government support, are not going to bounce back, which means we're going to have very high levels of unemployment, which means that it's going to be much harder than it has been previously for the Tory government to sort of present anyone who doesn't currently have a job as a scrounger who deserves to be punished, as opposed to deserves the support of the safety net, which we all pay towards, right? And so I think that's going to be where the debate is. And also, I mean, there's going to be a huge argument, debate, hopefully, if Keir Starmer's pushing for this, as to where we want our economy to go next. You saw today that British Airways are saying they're going to let go, or potentially let go, 12,000 employees, a quarter of their staff. And they've said explicitly that's because even after the lockdown ends, they don't believe that there is going to be demand for their service to go back to normal for 5 years or so, right? So you were going to have huge, and that's going to apply to many industries. Obviously, airlines are a particular extreme example, but I can see the same existing for gigs, for football. We're a service economy, for so many of our jobs are
nightclubs, gyms, whatever.
Yeah, and in a service economy, so many jobs people are serving a human to human, and I think people are going to feel a bit more, less inclined to do that nowadays. And so you are going to see unemployment rise, and there is going to have to be a political response to that, which can't just be victimizing those who don't currently have a job.
Yeah, I think the thing about sectoral changes, I mean, clearly we're not going to go back to business as usual with all the things you just talked about. And I think what may happen is that the Tories will say, well, we'll keep the furloughing scheme for particular sectors. But I just think, that's why I think, I think there is a relationship here actually between changing unemployment benefit and this conversation, because I think the left should just say, look, it's silly to pay the wages for a bunch of people and a bunch of jobs which just aren't going to exist very soon. I mean, BA is a really easy example, right? Norwegian Airlines, I think, said yesterday they don't anticipate using their full fleet again until January 2022, right? I mean, and they've got basically, I think they're using 7 planes right now of their entire fleet. They expect their baseline is that will carry on for the next year. And so the question is, okay, do you pay the wages of these people to stay on the company payroll, or do you just pay them? I'm not saying pay them any less. I mean, but you probably pay them a similar figure, unemployment benefit, and then they can go and look for other jobs in the meantime, right? And they don't have to live in penury and poverty. And I just think we need to have a proper conversation now around, okay, well, we've done this furlough thing. Do we want to subsidize a bunch of jobs which aren't really going to exist in 3 months' time? Or do we actually want to use this money to have an unemployment insurance system which works and gives people dignity? And I think there's a huge opportunity there. And if Labour don't take that in the next 3 months, 3 to 6 months, I think it will be a real shame. Do you have anything else to say about this, Mike? We'll move to the next story.
I'd just say very briefly, I think it's a do both. I think tapering the furlough seems sensible. I don't see why the government shouldn't try and save jobs where it's possible. And if a business can get itself back on its feet by winter, then why not give them this sort of tapered approach to the furlough scheme? But, I also agree that this should be an opportunity to argue for a more generous unemployment scheme and see it as, a fact of life that people sometimes lose their jobs instead of a moral failure.
I'm just going to look at some of the comments. Spot on, Aaron. My favourite kind of comment. Thank you, Billy Neville. God, this is from Solskjaer 1999. God, I hope Branson's sweating just a little, probably more than just a little. Malika Agabi, UBI is the only lads. Wake up, man. Where is the real left? Well, I think I'd hope we're on the left, but UBI is something we need to discuss for sure. Other people saying UBI. This question from Joel. We'll be able to protect public utilities from market forces once we're out. We can talk about that towards the end. If you're enjoying the show, do Michael a favor. He always talks about it. He bites my ear off. hit the subscribe button. And like I say, smash like. We're almost at 1,000. That means a lot to me. One final part to the show. Michael Gove doesn't want to extend the Brexit deadline. This is quite funny. This is from the Times today. Let's pull this up. Kind of talk about living in a parallel universe. That's fine. Put up the quote card. That's fine. We believe it's still entirely possible, rather, to conclude negotiations on the timetable that has been outlined, Mr. Gove said. He added that the EU side was continuing to press for one agreement covering all areas of the future relationship, including trade, fishing rights and security, while the UK was pushing for a series of separate agreements. So a few things here. We believe it's still entirely possible doesn't sound to me like it's particularly confident. And then the final sentence is about the UK wants one thing and the EU wants something completely different. So I don't really buy the headline there. Then the next quote from Mr. Gove: I think the COVID crisis in some respects should concentrate the minds of EU negotiators in enforcing the vital importance of coming to a conclusion. I mean, why would it focus the minds of EU negotiators any more than our own? Although in his defense, Mr. Gove told the committee on the future relationship with the EU that, quote, I'm not very good at predictions. So, I mean, that's not reassuring, but at least he's being honest about his track record. What he said was at odds with Norbert Röttgen, chair of the Bundestag's Foreign Affairs Committee, who told the Observer on Sunday he thought it was quite unlikely we're going to see a deal this year. Let's get a quote up from Röttgen. Quote, I can't imagine now that this is possible, given the fact that all EU countries, Brussels and London, are so absorbed by the pandemic, and this will go on. Given the situation, I don't believe that there is a realistic possibility any longer to even achieve the necessary minimum. So you have to extend. Michael, what's going on here? Is this just brinkmanship from Michael Gove? It's two things here, right? Are they just kind of kicking it into the long grass? Are they looking to blame the EU? Or actually, could they use the coronavirus crisis, the coronavirus economy, as a means of basically doing a no deal? And most people wouldn't notice, right? I mean, they wouldn't notice. It wouldn't be as spectacular as it would have been, say, last December.
Yeah, I think it's the latter. And I think the reason Michael Gove has said he's standing down no deal planning is because they know that it would be a vulnerability if it looked like the government were investing time in anything other than defeating COVID-19. Sorry, I'm borrowing the language of it being a war as well, other than insulating society from COVID-19. And so I think that's why he said that. But I do think actually the government are seriously considering having a no-deal Brexit in January. And the reason is, I mean, there's a number of reasons. So one, any kind of Brexit was always going to risk causing an economic hit. And when this coronavirus crisis is over, the government are going to want to have a nice period of steady growth right up until the 2024 election. They don't want to have Brexit suddenly intervene and fuck that up, right? So that's one argument as to why you do it in the crisis as opposed to in the recovery. At the same time, a second reason, a WTO Brexit, so a Brexit where we don't have a trade agreement already agreed with the European Union. The risk there was always that it would create extra friction with trade. I mean, it's difficult to say, we've already got a fuckload of friction with trade. so there is an idea that, as you say, economically, you wouldn't notice that much. The hit would be smaller than usual because we're starting from a point of much lower levels of trade. And third, there's the political argument, which is that if a Brexit does damage the economy, if a no-deal Brexit in January does damage the economy, yes, that is a pretty awful time for us to experience an extra economic hit when we're dealing with so many other problems. So you could argue it's completely irresponsible in terms of public health to do this now, but politically people aren't going to know, was that economic slight downturn in January because of Brexit, or was it just the coronavirus crisis continuing? So I think that the government believe that this gives them a stronger negotiating hand because they can credibly threaten a no-deal Brexit in a way that they couldn't have done otherwise. Because otherwise, a no-deal Brexit was always going to cause economic damage. You're a government with a big majority. You don't want to do that. This is finally the perfect opportunity for them to push through the kind of Brexit they want without anyone really noticing.
Couldn't agree more. I think they'll do it. I think no deal is the plan. Because also it's just so easy to say, oh well, we've just gone into economic recession. Well, that was coronavirus, not no deal. Come on, a pandemic so much bigger than Brexit. You could make the person making the argument, even though they are correct, look stupid quite easily. I think they're going to go for it. I mean, I agree with you. They're going to want 3 years clean through to the next general election with ideally rising wages, rising growth, and they don't want the Brexit thing right in the middle of that. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, they don't want to be negotiating Brexit in 2022, right? So I think it will happen in January, and it will probably happen as a no-deal Brexit. And then afterwards, when we're all sort of discussing how do we refashion trade post-COVID-19, they'll just sort of integrate that discussion about trade deals into that much broader process.
Yeah.
It's quite smart, potentially.
I think it's extraordinarily smart. I think that's what they're going to do. And I think that there's a section of the left that will react in a very, very strange way and say we need to stay in the EU to defend, stop Corona. I mean, Anyway, maybe that can be one of the people coming into the questions. Let's take some questions right now. We've had a super chat from Ellen Rothney, €5. Are you guys optimistic about the potential for change, especially climate, as a result of all this? Over to you, Michael.
Yep. I mean, I say that in terms of, I'm not predicting everything's going to be rosy after this, but I think this crisis definitely has increased political opportunities for building a future which is less miserable than the one we inherited. And that's precisely because coronavirus has shown what the state can do. It has shown how damaging it is to have a completely weak neoliberal state which can't confront and is not up to the job of dealing with a crisis. It has also brought to light the importance of frontline workers, people who aren't necessarily on huge incomes, but are doing the jobs that society needs to continue. So yes, there are huge opportunities for the left, especially with climate change as well. This will hopefully bring about more of a culture whereby we take seriously future threats, even when there is a degree of uncertainty. The amount of times you've heard someone say, "Oh, well, this prediction was slightly wrong, so we can't do anything to mitigate against climate change." It's the kind of thing Julia Hartley-Brewer says. Yeah. I think now if someone puts forward that argument, you say, well, even if this prediction is slightly wrong, shouldn't we err on the side of caution? I think it's going to be much easier to make that argument. That said, there's also obviously going to be a huge counterattack from the right who are trying to refashion this crisis into something which suits them. Be that sort of saying we've got to pay off this coronavirus debt, so let's have austerity, or this is an excuse to raise our borders in the long term and have a more sort of potentially economic nationalism combined with a heightened degree of xenophobia, especially anti-China xenophobia.
If we can afford that, given we're just about to
that's true.
Give the EU a bunch of, give it the finger. Alan Kennedy gives us a $5 super chat. Thank you so much, Alan. I do think we need to be careful not to fall into the trap of a right-wing version of a UBI. Make sure we keep the welfare state enough intact. Michael, any response to that?
Yep, no, I totally buy that. I mean, it's UBI has been presented by some as a replacement for the welfare state and by others as something which you sort of add on top of it. I sort of see UBI as something that happens later on. So I kind of think of UBI not as how do you provide for your basics, and because I think your basics should really be provided by the state. If what you want is to give people good housing, why give them a UBI for them to pay a landlord instead of just providing the house directly? Same goes for health, and I think food should be fairly cheap. I think UBI, in my ideal vision of radical social democracy, is kind of your pocket money. It's the kind of thing you spend on what you don't necessarily need, but what makes your life more pleasurable. So I see UBI very much as an addition, something that sits on top of universal basic services, not necessarily the priority for right here and right now, even though obviously if someone was to put forward UBI right here, right now, I wouldn't oppose it.
This is from Daryl Kavanagh. Sorry, Daryl. Tweets on the hashtag TiskiSat. The neoliberal state hasn't only outsourced provision, it has outsourced the procurement of provision and has lost the institutional memory of how to do either. See Carillion, whose job was managing contracts on behalf of government. It's going to be a long way back. I mean, quickly, Michael, that's a really good point, isn't it? Because people have been very quick to compare the present situation to the war. And the reality is, the first half of the 20th century, whether it was the Tories, whether it was Labour, there was an increasing propensity towards centralisation. Setting up the BBC, the Department for Health, you had the Liberal government, Lloyd George, the People's Budget, etc. all that stuff was really a kind of preamble to what you get with the Beveridge Report in 1945. So there was a long kind of lead into that. Whereas now, I mean, many people agree we need similar solutions, but we haven't had 25, 30 years of people experimenting with this kind of stuff. Is there any way that we can kind of accelerate that on the left? Or, I mean, how, we're saying, we're going to need a national care service. Okay, how is that going to be run, given we have so many issues with the running and the procurement and the sort of outsourcing aspects right now of the NHS?
Well, so after the 1970s and during the 1980s, the right won an argument, which was to say that states are inherently inefficient. No one should really be planning stuff in states. We're not looking for innovation from the state. That should happen in markets. Therefore, all the essential functions of the state, we're going to outsource to private companies, such as Carillion, who will bid for tenders to provide public services, be that building a hospital or providing social housing. And the problem with this is that, one, it completely ripped capacity out of the state, because no one who knows how to build a building works for the government anymore. They work for some sort of private contractor. Yeah. And two, the real specialism that companies like Carillion got wasn't how to build a brilliant hospital. It was how to win contracts. So much of their expertise is put towards how do you tick all the boxes that mean the government give you the contract. Not much of it is how do you build an innovative, dynamic hospital, because you don't necessarily get the gig by innovating. And so you've got this system which was supposed to be innovative and was supposed to encourage efficiency, which has done the complete opposite. And I think that's why we can make this argument that, one, states aren't inefficient. We actually had a much more effective state when more was done directly by the state. And two, for any kind of future emergency, we can't afford to have a state which has been gutted of expertise, which has been gutted of the ability to do proper economic planning and to build institutions that work.
Well said. Quick shout out to Vlodek Tish. I hope I've said that correctly. And many thanks, as ever. Your work is so important on the Super Chat. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who's actually donated to Super Chats tonight. We've had several. Much appreciated. As I've said already, please subscribe to the channel. Michael will go to bed tonight much more soundly, knowing that you've done precisely that. Michael, who do you have on the show tomorrow?
I'm not sure yet. People will have to check our Twitter and our Facebook at the time, but I'm sure it will be someone very good.
Michael Walker, Novara Media MVP. My name's Aaron Bastani. You've been watching Tysky Sour. See you again tomorrow evening. Good night.